In 2015, in the small town of Tuscaloosa, Alabama, 42-year-old Sheriff Leroy Thompson lived a measured life filled with pride for his family and his work. His home sat on the outskirts of town, a modest two-story house with a wraparound porch shaded by towering oak trees, their branches heavy with Spanish moss that swayed gently in the warm southern breeze. The paint on the house was a soft cream color, weathered slightly by years of Alabama sun, but the yard was meticulously kept, with neat rows of azaleas lining the walkway and a tire swing hanging from a sturdy limb, a testament to the care Leroy put into the place he called home. Inside, the room smelled of cedar and faintly of the lemon polish his wife used on the furniture, creating an atmosphere that felt both lived in and cherished. This house was his sanctuary, a place where he raised his 3 children alongside his wife, Claire, whom he had married 17 years earlier in a small ceremony at the local Baptist church. Leroy's eldest son, Caleb, was 16, a lanky teenager with a restless energy that drove him to spend hours on the high school football field, dreaming of one day playing college ball and maybe even making it to the pros. His room was a shrine to his ambitions, walls plastered with posters of his favorite athletes and shelves cluttered with trophies from local tournaments. Sheila, the middle child at 9, was different, quieter, more introspective, often found curled up on the porch with a sketchbook in her lap, her pencils scratching out scenes of the riverbanks and cotton fields that stretched beyond the town limits. Her drawings were detailed, almost lifelike, capturing the world she saw with a sensitivity that Leroy admired but didn't fully understand. The youngest, Eli, was 8, a small boy with wide eyes and a habit of asking questions about everything: why the sky turned pink at dusk, how the crickets knew when to sing, what made the stars stay up in the sky. He trailed after his father whenever he could, clutching a toy sheriff's badge Leroy had given him years ago. Leroy himself was a man of unwavering principles, shaped by a childhood spent under the strict guidance of his parents, who had instilled in him a deep sense of duty and honor. He stood tall, with broad shoulders that filled out his sheriff's uniform, his badge gleaming on his chest like a mark of his identity. His days began before dawn, coffee brewing in the kitchen as he reviewed case files or prepared for patrols, and ended late, often after the rest of the town had gone to bed. He took his role seriously, knowing the people of Tuscaloosa relied on him to keep order in a place where life moved slowly but troubles could still bubble up unexpectedly. The community respected him for it, neighbors waved when he drove by in his patrol car, shopkeepers saved him a seat at the diner counter, and folks at the Sunday service always made a point to shake his hand. To Leroy, this respect was hard-earned, a reflection of the life he had built brick by brick. His younger brother, Marcus, was a frequent visitor to the Thompson home, arriving with a wide grin and a carefree swagger that contrasted sharply with Leroy's steady demeanor. At 38, Marcus had never settled into anything permanent. Jobs came and went, from mechanic work at the garage to stints hauling lumber, each abandoned when the novelty wore off or the hours grew too demanding. His hair was always a little longer than Leroy's, his clothes a touch flashier, and his laugh carried across rooms, drawing people in despite his tendency to skirt responsibility. Marcus had a way of slipping into the family routine, tossing a football with Caleb in the yard, teasing Sheila about her latest drawings, or scooping Eli up onto his shoulders for an impromptu ride around the living room. Leroy watched these moments with a quiet satisfaction, glad that his brother seemed to fit so naturally into the life he had created. He trusted Marcus implicitly, seeing his presence as a bridge between their past as siblings and the present they now shared. The Thompson household ran on a rhythm that felt unshakable. Morning started with Claire in the kitchen, the sizzle of bacon filling the air as she packed lunches and sent the kids off to school, while Leroy kissed her goodbye before heading to the station. Evenings brought them back together, the table set with plates of cornbread and collards, the clatter of forks mingling with the hum of the old radio playing gospel tunes in the background. Sundays were for church, the family filing into a pew near the front, Leroy's deep voice joining the congregation's hymns while Claire kept Eli from fidgeting too much. Afterward, they'd host a barbecue in the backyard, smoke rising from the grill as neighbors drifted over with casseroles and stories. Marcus was often there too, charming everyone with his quick wit and easy manner, his laughter blending with the cicadas' song as dusk settled over the pines. To Leroy, this was the life he had always wanted, a family rooted in love, a community bound by trust, a legacy he could pass down. Beneath the surface, though, shadows lurked, secrets woven into the fabric of his world that he couldn't yet see. Claire and Marcus had known each other long before Leroy ever entered her life. Their paths first crossed in their early 20s, back when Claire worked the counter at a dusty roadside cafe just off Highway 69, her apron stained with coffee and grease from the lunch rush. Marcus was a regular then, rolling in with a pack of friends, his voice loud over the jukebox as he ordered sweet tea and biscuits, tossing winks at the waitresses like coins into a fountain. He barely noticed Claire at the time. She was just another face behind the counter, her hands quick with the coffee pot, her smile polite but distant. Yet something about him lingered in her memory, the way he leaned back in the booth, legs stretched out, owning the space without effort, or the glint in his eye when he laughed at his own jokes. Nothing happened between them then, no grand romance or even a fleeting fling, but a spark flickered, buried beneath the humdrum of small-town days, waiting for a chance to catch. Years later, when Leroy brought Claire home to meet his family after months of shy courtship, Marcus recognized her instantly. She stood in the living room of their childhood home, her hair pulled back in a loose bun, shaking hands with their mother, and Marcus felt a jolt of memory, those same steady hands pouring coffee, that same quiet poise. Claire caught his gaze, and for a split second, her eyes widened in recognition before she masked it with a smile. Leroy, oblivious, clapped his brother on the shoulder, proud to introduce the woman he loved, unaware that Marcus already knew her in a way he never would. From that moment, something unspoken reignited between them, a thread from the past pulling taut across the years. It started innocently enough, Marcus dropping by the house to fix a leaky faucet when Leroy was stuck late at the station, his toolbox clanging as he knelt under the sink, or offering to drive Caleb to football practice when Claire's car wouldn't start. These visits were casual, unremarkable to anyone watching, just a brother-in-law lending a hand. Over time, though, the encounters stretched longer, the air between them thickening with something neither acknowledged at first. Marcus lingered after tightening a shelf or patching a screen door, leaning against the kitchen counter while Claire chopped onions for supper, the two of them trading stories about the old days, the cafe, the characters who used to drift through the heat of those endless summers. His charm worked its way under her skin, slow and steady, like water wearing down stone. Claire, who spent too many nights alone while Leroy chased down leads or sat through town meetings, felt the weight of her husband's absence more keenly with each passing year. Marcus noticed her in ways Leroy didn't, how her shoulders slumped when she thought no one was looking, how she hummed to herself while folding laundry, how her eyes lit up when someone asked about her day. He filled the gaps Leroy left behind, his attention a balm to her quiet loneliness. The shift from friendship to something more happened gradually, almost imperceptibly. One humid afternoon, while Leroy was out on a call about a bar fight downtown, Marcus stopped by to help Claire move a heavy cedar chest to the attic. Sweat beaded on their foreheads as they wrestled the thing up the narrow stairs, their hands brushing as they steadied it against the wall. When they finished, they stood in the attic's dim light, catching their breath, and Marcus reached out to wipe a streak of dust from her cheek. Claire didn't pull away. That touch, small, fleeting, cracked open a door they'd both kept shut, and soon after, stolen moments became a pattern. A quick meeting in the garage while the kids played outside, a late-night visit under the guise of dropping off a borrowed tool, a brush of fingers when no one else was in the room. Their affair grew bolder but stayed hidden, cloaked in the normalcy of family life. Marcus found a twisted satisfaction in it, a way to chip at the pedestal Leroy stood on, his brother, the disciplined sheriff with the perfect life, the man who'd always outshone him without trying. Taking Claire felt like claiming a piece of that life, a quiet rebellion against the shadow he'd lived in since they were kids. For Claire, it was different. She didn't hate Leroy, didn't want to destroy what they had, but Marcus made her feel alive again, seen in a way she hadn't been since the early days of her marriage. Guilt gnawed at her sometimes, late at night when she lay beside Leroy's sleeping form, but it wasn't enough to stop her. Their secret stretched across years, woven into Sunday dinners and backyard barbecues, Marcus tossing a ball with Caleb or teasing Sheila while Claire watched from the porch, her heart caught between two brothers. The deepest cut of their betrayal lay in the children. Caleb, born a year after Claire and Leroy's wedding, carried Marcus's restless energy in his bones. Sheila came 2 years later, her smile a mirror of the one Marcus flashed so easily. Eli, the youngest, arrived when the affair was well underway, his wide eyes echoing Marcus's own. Leroy never questioned their parentage, never saw the resemblance that hid in plain sight. He loved them too much, trusted too deeply. Claire and Marcus took care to keep their meetings discreet, timing them around Leroy's long shifts or the kids' school schedules, their lies polished smooth by practice. The house on the edge of Tuscaloosa held their secret like a vault, its walls silent witnesses to a bond that grew stronger with every passing year, threatening the fragile peace Leroy believed was his. Everything shifted one humid evening in late August when Leroy overheard Claire on the phone with her friend, her voice drifting through the screen door as he stepped onto the porch after a long shift. She laughed lightly, her tone casual, and mentioned how Eli had picked up Marcus's walk, that loose, loping stride that always seemed to carry a hint of swagger. The words slipped out so naturally that Claire didn't even pause, but they lodged in Leroy's mind like a splinter under a fingernail, sharp and impossible to ignore. He stood there for a moment, boots still caked with dust from the day's patrol, the cicadas buzzing in the trees around him, and tried to brush it off. People saw resemblances all the time, he told himself. Family traits bounced around, especially between uncles and nephews. But the thought wouldn't let go, rooting itself deeper as he kicked off his shoes and stepped inside, the cool air of the house doing little to settle the unease curling in his chest. At first, Leroy fought the suspicion, chalking it up to exhaustion from a string of late nights at the station, a stolen car case that had kept him chasing leads across county lines. He sat at the kitchen table that night, picking at a plate of leftover fried chicken while Claire hummed in the next room, and tried to focus on the normalcy of it all, the clink of dishes in the sink, the muffled sound of Caleb's music thumping upstairs, the familiar creak of the floorboards underfoot. But the next day, as he watched Eli scamper across the yard to grab a fallen stick, Leroy couldn't unsee it. The boy's gait matched Marcus's so precisely, each step a little too long, a little too easy, like he was sauntering into a room he already owned. Doubt began to gnaw at him, a quiet rustle in the back of his mind that grew louder with every passing hour. Soon, Leroy found himself studying his other children, searching their faces and movements for traces he'd never thought to look for before. Caleb came home from practice that week, tossing his gym bag onto the porch with a sharp, sudden motion that reminded Leroy of Marcus flinging a wrench across the garage during one of their teenage arguments, quick, almost reckless. Sheila sat at the dining table one afternoon, sketching a mockingbird perched on the fence, and when she grinned at her own work, the curve of her lips echoed Marcus's crooked smile, the one he flashed when he thought he'd gotten away with something. These details piled up like stones, each one small but heavy, building a wall of suspicion Leroy couldn't climb over. He lay awake at night beside Claire, her breathing soft and steady, and wondered how he'd missed it, if he'd missed it, or if his mind was just playing tricks, twisting innocence into something sinister. The uncertainty ate at him until he couldn't stand it anymore. Leroy decided to put an end to the questions, to dig for the truth no matter what it cost. He'd seen enough cases in his years as sheriff, cheating spouses, hidden pasts, to know that answers didn't come from hoping or guessing. Late one night, after the house had gone quiet, he sat in his patrol car outside the station, the glow of his phone screen casting shadows across his face as he ordered a DNA test kit online. He typed in the sheriff's office address for delivery, not wanting Claire to stumble across a package at home, and paid with a credit card he kept for emergencies, his fingers hesitating over the keys before hitting confirm. The wait for it to arrive stretched his nerves thin. Every creak of the mailbox made his pulse jump, though he masked it behind his usual calm demeanor, checking reports, joking with deputies, nodding at townsfolk like nothing was wrong. When the kit finally showed up, tucked discreetly in a plain brown envelope among the station's mail, Leroy stashed it in his desk drawer until he could act. He waited for the right moment, choosing a night when Claire was out at a church choir rehearsal and the kids were asleep. Moving silently through the house, he gathered what he needed: Caleb's toothbrush from the bathroom sink, still damp with a smear of mint paste, a few strands of Sheila's hair caught in the teeth of her comb, left on her dresser amid a scatter of pencils, and a crumpled tissue Eli had used at dinner, fished from the trash with a grimace. Each item went into a labeled plastic bag, his hand steady from years of handling evidence, though his stomach churned with every step. Back in his car, parked down the street under a flickering streetlight, he swabbed the inside of his own cheek, the cotton tip rough against his skin, and sealed it with the rest, his breath catching as he pressed the envelope shut. The next morning, Leroy dropped the package in the mail slot at the post office, his heart thudding under his uniform as he walked away. He told himself it was nothing, that the results would come back and prove him wrong, that he'd laugh at his own paranoia over a beer with Marcus one day soon. But as the days dragged on, waiting for the lab's response, the cracks in his world widened. He watched Claire pour coffee, her hand steady where his now shook, and wondered what else she might be hiding. He saw Marcus toss Eli into the air during a weekend visit, the boy's squeal of delight piercing the air, and felt a pang he couldn't name. Leroy's life, once a solid foundation of duty and love, teetered on the edge of something he couldn't yet grasp, the truth lurking just out of reach, ready to pull it all apart. The results arrived on a gray Tuesday morning, 2 weeks after Leroy had mailed the samples, the envelope sitting innocently among a stack of routine paperwork on his desk at the sheriff's station. He waited until the office emptied out for lunch, the hum of the air conditioner the only sound as deputies shuffled out to grab sandwiches from the diner across the street. Alone, Leroy locked the door, his fingers trembling slightly as he slid a letter opener under the flap and pulled out the thin sheaf of papers. The words stared back at him in cold, clinical print: Caleb, Sheila, and Eli. None of them shared his DNA. Beside each name, the report listed a biological match to another male, identified only by a sample code, but Leroy didn't need a name to know who it was. Marcus. The realization hit him like a fist to the gut, knocking the breath from his lungs. He sat back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight, and stared at the ceiling, the fluorescent lights blurring as his eyes stung with unshed tears. His mind reeled, spinning through years of memories now tainted by the truth. Every late-night patrol he'd worked to put food on the table, every scraped knee he'd bandaged, every proud moment watching Caleb score a touchdown or Sheila win an art prize, all of it built on a lie. The children he'd raised, loved, sacrificed for weren't his. Claire, the woman he'd vowed to stand by through sickness and health, had carried on with his own brother, right under his roof. And Marcus, who'd shared bunk beds with him as kids, who'd borrowed his truck and eaten at his table, had stolen the one thing Leroy held sacred. The betrayal cut deeper than anything he'd ever felt, a raw, jagged wound that bled out every ounce of trust he'd ever had. He crumpled the papers in his fist, the edges biting into his palm, and for a moment he couldn't move, couldn't think beyond the roar of pain and rage crashing through him. Something snapped inside Leroy then, a quiet fracture that severed the man he'd been from the one he was becoming. The sheriff who upheld the law, the father who kissed his kids goodnight, the husband who fixed the porch steps, they were gone, replaced by a hollow shell fueled by a need for retribution. He didn't plan, didn't weigh consequences, his thoughts narrowed to a single, burning point: Marcus had to pay. That evening, after the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned a bruised purple, Leroy drove his patrol car to the edge of Tuscaloosa, where the pavement gave way to gravel and the lights grew sparse. He knew Marcus would be at Rusty's, a dive bar tucked behind a gas station, its neon sign flickering over a parking lot littered with bottle caps and cigarette butts. Sure enough, Marcus's beat-up Chevy was there, parked crookedly near the door. Leroy stepped out of the car, his boots crunching on the gravel, the weight of his service pistol heavy against his hip. He didn't hesitate, didn't call out. The bar's door swung open under his push, the stale air thick with smoke and the twang of a jukebox playing some old country tune. Marcus sat at the far end, slouched over a beer, his laughter cutting through the murmur of the handful of regulars scattered around. Leroy crossed the room in long strides, his face a mask of stone, and grabbed Marcus by the collar of his flannel shirt. The bottle tipped over, spilling foam across the counter, but Leroy didn't stop, dragging his brother outside as the other patrons froze, too stunned to intervene. Marcus stumbled, his boots scraping the ground, his hands flailing for balance as Leroy hauled him into the shadowed alley beside the bar. In the dim glow of a street lamp, Leroy shoved Marcus against the brick wall, the rough surface snagging at his shirt. Marcus's eyes widened, a flicker of confusion crossing his face, but before he could react, Leroy pulled the pistol from its holster. The metal gleamed faintly as he pressed the barrel to Marcus's chest, right over the heart that had betrayed him. His finger tightened on the trigger, and the shot rang out, sharp and final, echoing off the alley walls. Marcus gasped, a wet, choking sound, and slid down the wall, his body crumpling onto the cracked pavement, blood pooling beneath him in a dark, spreading stain. Leroy stood over him for a heartbeat, watching the life fade from his brother's eyes, the gun still warm in his hand. Then he turned, his steps steady but mechanical, and walked back to his car, the night swallowing him whole as his mind churned with the next step, an end to everything he'd once called his own. Leroy drove home under a moonless sky, the headlights of his patrol car cutting through the darkness as he wound along the quiet backroads of Tuscaloosa. The clock on the dashboard glowed 2:17 a.m., the only sound the low rumble of the engine and the occasional chirp of crickets beyond the windows. His hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles pale against the worn leather, but his face remained blank, as if the man inside had drifted somewhere far beyond the shell that steered the vehicle. The gun rested on the passenger seat, its barrel still warm from the shot that had ended Marcus's life, a silent witness to the unraveling of everything Leroy had once been. He pulled into the driveway, the gravel crunching under the tires, and sat for a moment, staring at the house, its cream paint ghostly in the night, the porch swaying faintly in a breeze he didn't feel. He stepped out, leaving the car door ajar, and moved toward the garage, his boots heavy on the ground. Inside, the air smelled of oil and damp wood, the shelves cluttered with paint cans and old tools. He found the metal gas can tucked in a corner, half full from a summer of mowing the lawn, its weight sloshing as he lifted it. Without pause, he carried it into the house, the screen door creaking as he pushed it open with his shoulder. Claire and the children slept upstairs, their breaths soft and even, unaware of the storm that had already claimed Marcus and now crept through their home. Leroy started in the living room, tilting the can to let the gasoline spill across the rug, the sharp fumes rising as liquid soaked into the fibers and puddled on the hardwood. The couch, where he'd napped on lazy Sundays, took a heavy dousing, the cushions darkening under the flow. He moved methodically, like a man following a checklist he couldn't articulate, climbing the stairs with the can in hand. The gasoline splashed against the railing, dripping down to the steps below, and he poured a trail along the second-floor hallway, past the closed doors of the bedrooms where Caleb, Sheila, and Eli lay dreaming. The walls, lined with framed photos, Claire beaming at their wedding, the kids grinning on a fishing trip, caught stray splashes, the liquid streaking the glass. He emptied the last of the can near the master bedroom, where Claire slept alone, her hair fanned across the pillow, the bed still indented from years of Leroy's weight beside her. The empty can clattered to the floor, a hollow sound swallowed by the silence, and Leroy reached into his pocket, pulling out a book of matches he kept for the grill. His fingers shook as he struck one, the tiny flame flaring bright against the dark, and he dropped it onto the gasoline-soaked carpet. The fire erupted with a whoosh, a hungry roar that swallowed the hallway in seconds, flames licking up the walls and curling around the banister. Leroy stumbled back, the heat stinging his face as the blaze spread, leaping to the living room below and clawing at the ceiling. He turned and walked out, the front door banging shut behind him, and stood in the yard, the grass cool under his boots as he watched the inferno take hold. Orange light spilled from the windows, shadows dancing across the oak trees, and the crackle of burning wood filled the night, a sound like bones snapping. Smoke billowed upward, thick and black, curling into the sky as the house, his house, became a pyre for the life he'd lost. For a moment, he stood transfixed, the fire's glow reflecting in his empty eyes, his mind a void where reason had once lived. But the plan unraveled faster than he'd expected. Across the street, old Mr. Hargrove, a widower who rarely slept, jolted awake at the sound of the fire's first loud pop, his bedroom window facing the Thompson place. He squinted through the glass, saw the flames licking at the porch, and fumbled for the phone, dialing 911 with arthritic fingers. Within minutes, the wail of sirens pierced the stillness, red and blue lights flashing as fire trucks barreled down the road. Leroy blinked, the noise snapping him from his trance, and watched as firefighters leapt from the vehicles, hoses uncoiling like snakes. They smashed through the front door, disappearing into the smoke, their shouts muffled by the roar of the blaze. Moments later, they emerged, dragging Claire out first, her nightgown singed and her face smudged with soot, coughing violently as she collapsed onto the grass. Caleb followed, staggering under his own weight, then Sheila, her arms clutching a blanket, and finally Eli, cradled in a firefighter's arms, his small body limp but breathing. Leroy stood frozen as the scene unfolded, the air thick with the stench of burning wood and gasoline, the shouts of the rescuers blending with the crackling fire. Claire lifted her head, her eyes wild with fear and confusion, searching the yard until they locked onto him. For a heartbeat, their gazes held, but Leroy didn't move, didn't speak. The weight of what he'd done, and what he'd failed to finish, pressed down on him, a crushing force that drowned out the chaos. As the paramedics swarmed in, wrapping blankets around the family and pressing oxygen masks to their faces, Leroy stepped back, retreating into the shadows of the trees lining the property. His mind, already fractured, splintered further, a kaleidoscope of rage, guilt, and loss spinning him into darkness as he slipped away from the burning wreckage of his world. Dawn broke over Tuscaloosa with a pale, watery light, the air still heavy with the acrid tang of smoke from the night before. The police wasted no time piecing together the carnage. Marcus's body had been found in the alley behind Rusty's, a single bullet hole in his chest, the pavement stained dark beneath him. Witnesses from the bar pointed to Leroy, their descriptions of the sheriff dragging his brother outside unmistakable, even through the haze of shock and cheap beer. Hours later, the fire at the Thompson house sealed the connection, the gasoline-soaked ruins and Claire's frantic recounting to the paramedics painting a grim picture. By mid-morning, Leroy's name crackled over police radios, a statewide alert issued for the man who'd once worn the badge with pride. Deputies who'd worked under him shook their heads in disbelief, their voices low as they combed the town, but Leroy didn't run far. They found him just after sunrise, perched on a flat rock along the banks of the Black Warrior River, a few miles north of town. The water flowed sluggish and brown, lapping at the muddy shore, while cypress trees loomed overhead, their knobby roots clawing into the earth. Leroy sat hunched, his uniform rumpled and streaked with soot, the pistol resting loosely in his lap, its barrel glinting faintly in the weak light. His hands trembled, not from cold but from the weight of the night, his fingers twitching against the gunmetal as if unsure whether to grip it tighter or let it fall. When the officers approached, their boots squelching in the damp soil, guns drawn but held low, Leroy didn't flinch. His eyes, glassy and distant, stared past them to the river, and he raised his hand slowly, letting the weapon slip to the ground with a dull thud. They cuffed him without resistance, the metal clicking shut around his wrists, and led him to the patrol car, his steps shuffling like a man already half gone. The trial came swiftly, the courtroom in the Tuscaloosa County Courthouse packed with reporters and townsfolk who'd once tipped their hats to Leroy on Main Street. The prosecution laid out the case with ruthless precision: first-degree murder for Marcus, arson for the house, and 3 counts of attempted murder for Claire, Caleb, Sheila, and Eli, each charge a hammer blow to the legacy he'd built. Evidence piled up, ballistics matching the bullet to Leroy's service weapon, gas and fingerprints, the 911 call from Mr. Hargrove timestamped just minutes after the fire began. The community reeled, their whispers filling the diner and the church pews, tales of the steadfast sheriff replaced by a narrative of madness and violence. The prosecutor painted him as a monster, a man who'd turned his authority into a tool of vengeance, while the defense argued he'd been broken by betrayal, his mind shattered beyond reason. Leroy sat through it all, head bowed, his face carved from stone, offering no defense beyond a quiet nod when asked if he understood the charges. The judge delivered the sentence on a crisp fall day, the courtroom hushed as the gavel fell: life without parole, a lifetime behind bars at the state penitentiary in Atmore. The words echoed in Leroy's ears, final and unyielding, but they barely touched him. The real punishment had already taken root, deeper than any cell could reach. Claire and the children, released from the hospital with smoke-scarred lungs and haunted eyes, left Tuscaloosa soon after, piling into a borrowed sedan with what little they'd salvaged from the ashes. They settled in Montgomery, 100 miles away, where Claire found work at a grocery store and the kids enrolled in new schools, their lives stitched together with fragile threads. Nightmares plagued them, flames licking at their beds, the sound of sirens, the sight of Leroy vanishing into the dark, scars that time dulled but never erased. In his cell, Leroy existed in a gray limbo, the concrete walls cold against his back as he sat on the thin cot, staring at the ceiling where cracks spiderwebbed like veins. He didn't seek forgiveness, didn't write apologies to the town or beg for redemption. He'd lost everything, first to Claire and Marcus's deceit, then to the fire he'd set with his own hands, and the weight of it pressed down on him, a burden he carried alone. Sleep brought no relief. His dreams were consumed by the house ablaze, the roar of the fire drowning out all else, but now the flames parted to reveal the faces of Caleb, Sheila, and Eli, their eyes wide with fear, reaching for him through the smoke. Years later, he scratched out a letter on prison stationery, his handwriting shaky, asking them not to hate him, to remember the father he'd been before the fall. He sent it to the last address he knew, a rented duplex in Montgomery, but the envelope came back unopened, stamped "Return to Sender," and Leroy tucked it under his mattress, the silence of their refusal louder than any verdict.